Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to what I think is going to be an intellectual delight, and that is our presentation from Dr. Omolola Olarinde Olomola from Elizade University, Ilaramokin, and she's based in Nigeria. So let me tell us a little bit about her. She graduated from the same university, from my undergraduate university, which is University of Ibadan. We like to say we are the best in Nigeria, maybe in Africa, right? Although people haven't recognized the Africa part yet. So Omolola Olarinde Olomola has a PhD in economics from the University of Ibadan. She's an internationally engaged researcher whose work focuses on labor economics, migration, gender, and inclusive, sorry, my eyes are betraying me, inclusive development. She holds the position of senior lecturer at Elizade University, Ilaramokin, Nigeria. She has served as a research associate on the UK-funded Migration for Inclusive African Growth, MIAG project, which is a multi-country collaboration led by the Open University UK. The project involves institutions in Nigeria, Ghana, Mozambique, and Kenya. Currently, she's the local principal investigator from Nigeria on the Dynamic Horizon Europe 2020 project, which is going from 2023 to 2025. It's coordinated by Kiel University in Germany. In this role, she leads the gender committee and contributes substantively to empirical and conceptual research outputs on migration, gender, and inclusive growth. She has published in reputable peer-reviewed journals and co-authored several project reports and policy-relevant research papers with African and international collaborators. Her recent works explore epistemological questions in gendered migration research and the governance of labor migration in West Africa. She also writes and presents papers on knowledge production from underrepresented regions. Dr. Olarinde Olomola has mentored undergraduates, postgraduate, that is, well, graduate students, as we say here, and postdoctoral candidates in research. She contributes actively to scholarly discourse through editorial roles in journals such as the African Review of Economics and Finance, and also a journal that I founded and edit in the Kerido International Journal of African Migration. Dr. Olarinde Olomola is a member of the Network of Migration Research in Africa, or NOMRA, and the Nigerian Economic Society. Her future research plans include deepening interdisciplinary research on migration, gender, and knowledge production, and expanding research networks to inform inclusive development policy. So she has an ORCID profile and, a Google Scholar page from which people can find out more about her research. And she's on LinkedIn, so, anybody that wants to connect with her should please do so. I find her to be a brilliant and personable, person, very delightful to work with. And it is a pleasure to welcome her to Brooklyn College. So the title of the talk is Japada, Transnational Linkages and Non-Homothetic Migration Aspirations in a Nigeria Sample. So Dr. Olarinde Olomola, over to you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. And I thank you once more for the opportunity to present some of our work here. This work is drawing from our Dynamic project, which is a partnership between European and African countries where we're studying migration aspirations, trajectories, and its impact on policy. So I will be presenting a small part of our work which focuses on aspirations and which focuses only on Nigeria. The project covers Nigeria, Kenya, Morocco, and then we treat these countries, we treat Nigeria as source, Morocco as transit, even though they have multiple roles. So Nigeria is also, destination, but we treat as source, and then we treat the movement. So Nigerians in Italy, so we have partners in Italy collecting data, and Nigerians in the UK, we have partners in UK that collected data, and we try to pull it all together. So source, transit, and destination. And I've pulled out results that are particularly from the interviews done in Nigeria. And what I'm focusing on, I'm sure many of you have heard the terminology Japa, and Adegoke, who is with King's College in London, talks about it as fleeing. There's a sense of urgency to the word, and there's a tendency to talk a lot about Nigerian people's migration aspirations as being in this way. But I think there's more to it. Recently, there's been the talk about return, which is the Japada. And before now, we only used to talk about Ja without the urgency of Japa. So I try to talk about these three things. I'll pull them all together. What the core of my message is that this is not a one-time decision. An aspiration is not really, a migration aspiration is not really a one-time decision in which someone says, I'm leaving, and then that's all, it just moves on from I'm leaving. It's multifaceted, but in more, it's also this word I use when I say it's non-homothetic. Is we tend to think about it when you have higher income, do you have more capabilities and migrate more? We tend to think about it in those senses. But what I'm trying to pull out with this word is that it's not so much the proportion of aspirations that changes, but the nature of aspirations that change. And so I'm going to try to look at this with interviews done. So this is not a quantitative presentation, not presentation of quantitative results, but of narratives and how we can draw inspiration from what the migrants themselves tell us. So I'm going to move right away. Well, we'll see this. I'll do a bit on theoretical framing, then I'll talk about our work, and then I'll talk about, I'll show some graphs about this non-homothetic nature of aspirations, and then I'll talk about what our respondents say. So this is a picture from the internet that we use on our project, but I also have other pictures coming up that we've taken during the field work. All right, so as I said earlier on, when you see my results, I don't want you to take them with the impression that Nigeria is only an origin country for migrants. We are a net positive migration country, so a little more emigration than immigration, but we do have significant immigration into Nigeria from across the globe. And this is a chart that I've taken from my previous project, which is the Migration for Inclusive African Growth project, where we look at some very interesting data from OCHA, where they look at daily, they use Facebook to look at daily chats and where they're emanating from, and they use that to predict, who is where. And you can see there's significant global south, but also global north representation. This is just a few selected countries. What our research tries to do is to draw strength by looking at a heterogeneous mix of people. By that we mean we need a focus on what is commonly done for Nigeria, this irregular migration, nor on regular migration. We just speak to people with regards to their aspirations. We specifically treated Nigeria as an origin country, and we specifically try to look for people who already have an aspiration to migrate. So this is not about predicting the aspiration to migrate, it's about what people who have an aspiration or a migration experience are saying about how these aspirations were formed. So when we wrote our proposal, we were very much grounded in the work of Carling and Dehas, who have the aspiration ability for Carling and aspiration capability for Dehas theories. And we've looked at a number of studies, and when people think about these aspirations, they think about socio-demographic changes and how those drive aspirations. So, for example, do people with higher income have higher aspirations? And then to what extent does that drive capabilities? But what I'm thinking of in this question is it a matter of the more educated you are, the more or the less aspirations you have? Or is it a matter of the nature of those aspirations? And that's what we will be questioning. So when you look at, there's a lot of research on aspirations to migrate. I'm just quoting some recent work on the, I think that's the GAP project, where Hagen Zankar and others, including Carling, worked in Nigeria. There's a lot of work on aspirations to migrate and also on return migration. But there's very little expressing this aspiration as a continuum, how these aspirations continue to shift. And the reason is it's very difficult to do this. You need longitudinal data. We did have longitudinal data, but I'm not presenting how we did that longitudinally. What I'm presenting is how we did that, how I'm thinking about doing this with a one-time data period, so cross-sectional data for one time. So it's not just about return or aspiration to migrate, but the fact that aspirations shift. And that aspiration can shift. For example, you may think that I'm going away temporarily and shift to a permanent migration or the converse, or you may be having livelihood pressures and think about using migration as a strategy to overcome those pressures, or you may be thinking about migration as an opportunity. And in all of this, both conditions at origin and destinations matter. So we're not focusing only at, what they call push factors, so origin level factors. So my first step will be to think a bit more critically about what Carling and Dehas have put out, which is an excellent framework. The way that they think about aspirations is to say, well, you would see, so they distinguish this migration aspiration by saying that the person has the aspiration the moment they decide it's better to move than to stay. And so they distinguish these migration aspirations from aspirations overall. However, there is a challenge in this framing. The challenge is that it's a difficult thing to say because, it's a great theory, but it's very difficult to disentangle when someone's speaking to you about their aspirations. It's very difficult to disentangle which part of it is this migration aspiration and which part is a life aspiration. Raghuram talks about the demigratization of people, of citizens, and to stop thinking so much in this sense of migrants and to just think about these as people, and people in some sense that have aspirations, and sometimes this migration is just a way to a strategy or a way to meet these life aspirations. So this is where the theoretical difficulty lies. There's also the theoretical difficulty, which the authors themselves recognize, the overstating of the desire to move. So once you decide that there's a migration aspiration, that there's a mental shift that people have this thing, so that there's the bias towards thinking that people have this aspiration. But Carling and people he's worked with, but also they has, recognized that most people do not move at all. Some of that they has assigned to capabilities, but some of it has to do with a lack of aspiration, which is a very interesting topic on its own, a theoretical perspective on its own. And obviously, the authors recognize that it's difficult to think of aspiration as a single time and linear. So I aspire to do this, and the moment I leave the country, I aspire to migrate. Does my aspiration become, fulfilled the moment I do migrate, and is that the end of it? So this non-linearity of aspirations is quite difficult to capture, and which is why we felt that strong narratives maybe would be the way to go. I'm going to just disentangle these terms, which they follow through Japa, Japada. Well, I couldn't find academic literature on Ja, but I remember as a younger person, when we used to talk about migration, there wasn't that sense of urgency. We'll just say, I'm going to Ja, I'm leaving. And there wasn't the notation, the link, people didn't link this with never coming back or leaving because of distress. And closer to the 2020s, this idea of Japa came, and you see authors starting to talk about a sense of urgency, a sense of living permanently, a sense of fleeing associated with migration. And more recently now, there's been the Japada, which is a phenomenon that describes return. I use them in this sense, but I want us to think a little more about both the aspirations and the trajectories in the framing that I've given previously as non-linear, continuous, and non-homothetic. Okay, I think. All right. So as I said earlier on, our core literature was the migration aspiration framing, and how that led to decision making within Africa and with other countries that Africans transit to, destinations, and similar trajectories. So we focused quite a bit on trajectories, on temporalities, which is where we got this idea of dynamic. It's really a combination of two words, the dynamics of migration. That's what we used to coin our project title. We overall have 152 interviews, but I'm going to focus on the 46 that were done in Nigeria in this presentation. Our partners in Italy did what we call diaspora interviews, so they were interviewing people who were already Nigerians who were already in Italy, and they were looking at their aspirations to move onwards or how they arrived there. I'm going to speak a bit about this to differentiate between how interviews go on at origin countries and transit and destinations, but my results are basically going to focus on the Nigerian sample. And as I said, it was a heterogeneous sample, so we looked at different types of mobilities. It was people who have aspirations and different levels of aspiration, so desire, intention, plan. People who had achieved those aspirations, so to speak, whether they had embarked on a migration journey previously or were in transit, and these kind of mobilities. We used two instruments. One was sort of structured, so it's a survey instrument, and it asks background information, age, education, marital status, and that allows me to draw a few graphs here and there. And then we use detailed interviews. They lasted at least 45 minutes. Some of them lasted for 2 hours. So we engaged with the people in a relaxed manner and tried to hear very well what they said. Now you will see some names when I'm presenting, they are definitely not the names of the respondents, and the pseudonyms that we're using do not suggest, where they're from or, what religion they belong to or anything like that. So they're just coincidental. All right, so let's start with what we saw from our survey data. So, for example, we collected background information on levels of education, and then we collected background information on gender. And one thing you'll notice is right in the middle is the current migration status. So whether it's just at a desire stage, whether it's already at a plan stage, whether the person has left and returned, the person is a migrant or is in transit. Maybe a little bit more about our field work. We focused on Southwest Nigeria, mainly Lagos, but some interviews in Ondo and Ekiti, a few. We thought that Lagos was pretty cosmopolitan and captured a heterogeneous mix of migrant populations. But it also has, it's very different from the core north, for example, where climate is very important to migration aspirations. So at the end of the day, we have quite a number of economic migrants, so people who are just either seeking opportunity or leaving because they're moving away from, they're trying to get away from livelihood pressures. There was a lot of economic migrants among our respondents. So when we say the desire, these are people who have just started thinking, wishing. So, oh yes, I do want to migrate. And if I do, here is where I want to go to. We had something which we called a migration hub that measured, that asked the question, where do you wish to go to? And that kind of thing. People who were at the plan stage already started doing something. They had applied for a visa, or they were processing the passport, or they were seeking information about which university to go to, for example, if they wanted to migrate for study. They were doing a little more. Return is pretty, standard. So people who had a migration journey and were back in Nigeria. Migrant is someone who also had a migration journey but was on that journey. And transit is non-Nigerians who were transiting through Nigeria. So if we, just for information, we disaggregated this, we split it by gender. And one thing you notice is, at the plan stage, I don't know, let me see if I can pick up a pointer. Yes, let's see that. You can see here that there are more men relative to women at the plan stage, and women are more at the desire stage relative to men. And we thought that has to do with capabilities and abilities. For the benefit of, I don't know how specialized you are, but I mean the audience is. But what Carling says is, people do have the aspiration to migrate, but fewer people are able to because they either do not have enough income or they don't meet the criteria to use regular pathways. For example, they're under, they don't have the educational criteria. So we think that this has to do with reduced capabilities of women, for example. Here is another one. So the two major, apart from income, the other two major, let's say, socio-demographic indicators that aspiration theorists used to think about, the capabilities is employment, education, and, as I said earlier, income. And one of the things that's interesting that comes out of other studies, including DEHAS's, is that income is, employment. So more employment doesn't mean less aspirations, which is why I said earlier on that both source and origin and destination conditions matter. So, for example, you would think that, well, if someone's using migration as a means to improve their livelihood and they were previously unemployed, once they become employed, then they would want to migrate less. But in many studies, that's not the case. Many times, employment is a way to empower. So the person works to raise the funds for migration, because the aspiration remains. And this exact nature of aspirations is what we want to detangle. So how do these aspirations remain or change in nature based on whether someone is employed or not? And here we were a bit, we opened up this employment category a little more. So there was a possibility for part-time employment, full-time employment, or self-employment. So apart from the gendered dimension of it, you'd see that people who had employment were more at the plan stage. So it also reflects capabilities. You have the income that comes from your employment that you can use to plan your migration journey. In other words, secure your passport, apply for visas, and that kind of move. And a lot of people were also, a lot of respondents were also working while planning the next step, or studying while planning the next step. So I want to do my master's, and I'm planning that that's going to be abroad, not in Nigeria, for example. Or I'm already working, but I think that I need to move up in my career, and I think I need some, especially men, spoke a bit about migration in a sense of taking opportunities. I need to be part of another market where things are done differently. I need to get that experience and return with it to Nigeria and improve how work is done here. We had a lot of that narrative. And here is where I want to, I've pulled the two together. So on the x-axis, as we say in economics, but that's the horizontal axis. That's the bottom place. You see the education. And then you can see here the legend for the employment level. And what this really, I meant it to show is just that the entire colors shows that there is no regularity across socio-demographic indicators. And this is exactly the what you would see when something is not homothetic. So it's not so much that if I have higher education, I will aspire more or less, as it is about the nature of this education. And I discuss a little more here. For example, I try to think about it in the sense of the employment status. So people with higher education, they do display stronger migration aspirations, and they are able to realize their migration, but even when they have unemployment. Now, when they're part-time employed, they lower those aspirations. There's partial stability that comes from the employment. There's a reduced urgency, but those aspirations remain. So when there are domestic opportunities, people do shift their migration aspirations, and this is consistent with the ability aspiration framework. But this doesn't mean that we do not have the situation, as you can see from the variations in colors, as you could see, we do not have the situation that unemployed people, only unemployed people have these aspirations, or part-time employed people do not have the aspirations to migrate. So there is a livelihood pressure, which is consistent with push frameworks, that influences migration aspirations, but it's not limited to unemployed. And then I take the full-time employment and the self-employment. So full-time employed, regardless of the level of aspirations, show high, regardless of the level of education, show high aspirations, and particularly post-primary, so secondary school and university. And this is consistent with what we know in the literature. But also for self-employment, what's interesting is they show lower aspirations generally and lower realization generally. And a large part of our sample, I don't know if you're familiar with the Nigeria labor market, but there's a lot of informality in it, and a lot of people are generating their own income and employment, because that's how they're able to, make a livelihood. So there was a huge part of our sample that was self-employed. So it's not just about opportunity seeking and economic deprivation, their personal traits, their upward mobility motives. There is the point that economic self-sufficiency reduces the pressure of livelihood and reduces the desire to migrate, but that presents more for self-employed people than for full-time employment. So what I want to say is that beyond sophisticated diagrams, how about we move into the stories themselves? So what we did, the charts are generated from our studio, and they're from the survey data. And with regards to the detailed interviews, we had several pages which we put into MVivo and tried to code. And one of the codes that we brought out was, which stage of the migration status were they at. And for the stage of desire and intention, it was mostly desire. You haven't seen intention, for example. Intention showed up in other countries, but not really in Nigeria. So once they said they wished and they hoped, we captured this as intention, as desires. And we had 155 references. And for the plan stage, we had 19 sources and 37 references. I explained previously what this meant. So for example, someone who was looking at taking exams abroad because they wanted to qualify for a master's or qualify for a professional standard that they needed to meet to work abroad. So I'll give you examples of what we mean by desire. So as I said, we had a longitudinal study which was conducted by our colleague in Middlesex University in UK. So what we did is, once we completed the interviews in Nigeria, we asked the person for a second level of consent. Do you want to participate in a long study in which you will be submitting what we call video diaries? We call them digital diaries, videos, digital images of, how your decision to migrate is shifting. In this, some of the people whom we already interviewed participated, and we were able to get more information. I'm saying this because, for example, I'll talk a little more about Mivodere. But at the time I interviewed her in Nigeria, she was she was facing livelihood pressures, and she was thinking of migrating, but she wasn't sure. The reason she wasn't sure is that although she had a university degree, so that should have improved her capabilities, she was only getting offers to migrate irregularly. And she couldn't really make up her mind. She had heard a lot of stories about how dangerous this could be. She was at that stage where, as you can see what she's saying here, I'm praying to God. These are verbatim from what she said. I'm praying to God not to miss it. So she was at that stage where she's wants to make a decision that she will not regret, but she has a desire to leave, and mostly that was driven by, livelihood pressures she was facing. She could not afford her rent, and she was barely making enough to get by. And so she was thinking of some of the skills that would be useful if she was able to migrate. And she was not thinking, and this has to do with the de-skilling literature, but she was not thinking so much about her university degree, but about, other things she could do, practical skills like making hair. And here, the second person that I'm using to, describe this desire stage is Godwin, who plays in a football club and thinks about this football club as an opportunity to travel around the world and maybe even remain. So he's trying to get on a tour in which, he goes across countries, and then people are promising him that once you get in, we'll find a way to retain you in the country. So I'll take 3 examples of this desire Okay, and of this, I'm going to move on to the plan, and I'll take three examples of how plans are, in this sense, non-homothetic. So first is Queen. Queen has advanced in her plan. Her mom has already prepared for her to travel, and at the time of the interview, she had a passport. But, and this is peculiar, I was on the gender, work package, so I was particularly concerned about what limits various genders. But this is something that peculiarly happened to women, truncated opportunities based on something that's gone wrong. So she was unmarried, she already had 3 children. What her mother was trying to help her with was, to get better chances. But I mean, I can't tell if this was a good or a bad thing that her journey was aborted, because it was really a plan for an irregular migration journey. But what I want to pull out here is the fact that her opportunity stopped because she became pregnant. On the other hand, we have Temitope, who is planning his migration and thinking about how he's going to transfer his skills from Nigeria, to his destination. And the trade test that he was doing, and he was trying to make sure that he had certification that represented the skills that he was holding. So, and then to move. And in the case of Richmond, sorry, that name doesn't show up enough. So he's just already far along in his migration plan, and he was just awaiting his admission letter. So these are various stages of planning that our respondents are. Another tool that we used was this, what we call the blog bridge. And we use it at various times of the interview, either to break the ice and to help them to continue to talk more freely. In the middle of the interview, for instance, to continue to talk more freely, or even at the beginning. But most of the time, we used it towards the end of the interview. And we asked people, and so this is something that really captures emotions rather than, hard facts, so to say. So people, we ask them, where do you think you are? Who do you identify as? And as you can see, who they identify as is very subjective. So we'll have people right here saying, I'm tied down, I can't move, I'm in chains. But other people will say, here is someone who's arrested, Here, interestingly, the lady who picked this brownish color said, I'm the one saving someone who's fallen, and so on and so forth. So we have people who, a lot of them, as you can see, reflect what they're telling us. They're at the desire or intention stage. Some of them are already they're on the journey, and some of them think they have reached. But the thing is that people who pick this, I should learn my colors, this light purple at the end of the bridge, and not necessarily people who have migrated. So they distinguish between their aspirations they distinguish their aspirations from their migration aspirations. So I think I'm where I want to be, but I still want to do other things. I'm still going to migrate. I'm right here happy, but if I have this chance out, I think it's good for me. So I really liked this tool because it was it really encouraged conversation and a lot of laughing about who they thought was on this bridge. And also a lot of anger. Someone said, why you drew this bridge? Why are you asking me what it means? What did you want to say when you drew this? So there was a lot of emotion that the bridge showed. And some people said, well, you're already imagining that there's a journey when you're drawing this bridge. So they realized the way that, they spoke about the way that they saw things differently from us. And I thought it was a very useful tool, which is why I'm presenting it. All right, so I'm going to use a bit of stories to finish up and tell this non-homothetic nature of migration. I spoke about Mavedere earlier on. She has a university degree, no proper employment. She was selling snacks, doing a bit of catering here and there at the time that we met her. She's done this for a while, but she doesn't have economic stability. She doesn't think that things will get better if she gets married. Rather, she thinks she first needs to get her own economic stability. So she tells me her sister who's married tells her that men will respect her if she has her own money. And so first she has to have some livelihood, and then she thinks she should get married. And it's just not happening for her at origin. So she's thinking of migration as a way to achieve this aspiration she has. So this is where I talk about the difficulty in disentangling the life aspiration, because Mivedere then later talks about the fact that if she achieves her aspiration at origin, she will abort her plan to migrate, particularly because she's only getting regular migration options. And then we speak to Belvedere over 6 months. My colleague in UK does so. And based on, as she continues in her research, so she's looking at materials, how can I do this, how can I improve my life, if I took one of the options that was being offered to me to migrate irregularly, where would that lead me to? And she reports back to her colleagues to say, all of these options are no good for me, I prefer to stay. And it's very difficult to capture all of this in one word. I emphasize here the missing opportunities, because a lot of what's happening is from the livelihood pressures that she's facing at origin. But there's a lot more than this to her story. I'll take another case of Jima. Jima is from Chad. He has already migrated to North Africa. He's been returned he's been assisted to return voluntarily, as it said, assisted voluntary return and reintegration. But he has not met his aspiration for a better livelihood. So his migration has not ended in the way he wants it. It's not, so there's this lack of success of this migration journey. He back where he's coming from, he hasn't been able to secure employment, and he thinks, from his perspective, he thinks nepotism is his problem. If you don't know anybody, the way they say, then you never get a good job. And so he feels a sense of futility in, trying his hands there. He's been in Nigeria. Nigeria doesn't offer him more options. He still thinks of repeating the same journey, and this time doing it better, because he's still facing the same pressures that he had before his first migration journey. And Lawrence is really an interesting character. At the time that we met him, he was at the passport office in Lagos. I said that we did some convenience and purposive sampling because we were specifically targeting people. So it was not random. We were specifically looking at people who thought about migrating in some way. So we were either at passport offices or at centers where people were being trained for migration, or at embassies. And so Lawrence, we met at the passport office, and he was planning a third or fourth migration journey. He had already been to Spain and to France. And what he did was he wanted to migrate. And he seems to have this persistent idea that he needs to be elsewhere than his origin country. And so he's weighing his possibilities, and this has to do with his capabilities. So first he thinks, if I just go to the embassy as a first timer, nobody's going to give me a visa. So I'm going to go to a country that's easy to, enter. And he talks about this as opening his passport. So he just takes a trip to Cape Verde to show that he's traveled before. He doesn't fit the criteria to, at the time of the interview, to apply for work. I know a lot has changed in Spain since we did this interview in 2023. Spain is having a lot of regular migration pathways, including for low-skilled migrants. But this was not the case for Lawrence. He wanted to enter as a visitor and then work. And so he succeeds, he gets his visa into Spain, he finds employment, and he works for a couple of years. But then his employer really needs to renew his contract to be able to retain him. And here is where the issue of documentation comes in. They has a lot of work on what it means for, I'm trying to find my words carefully, whether to say global south, but from people from disadvantaged areas, in being able to get the kind of documentation you need to be able to meet your aspirations. They has, in fact, thinks that if, people had better regular pathways, that they will be able to move freely to where they, are best, where they fit the labor market best. And we do have evidence of this. I'll quickly jump to a story just to emphasize this point about one of our migrants who was in Morocco. So he was interviewed by my colleagues in Morocco. And the interesting thing is he was working irregularly in Italy on a farm as well, and seasonally too. And he worked for a number of years and then got his stay. And when he got his stay, he now had the proper documentation. So what he does is to go back to Morocco when it's off season and work as a taxi driver. And he had a very good relationship with his employer in Italy, so he would go there when his employer called him, during season. And this illustrates the point of how documentation can facilitate regular pathways. So Lawrence doesn't have this, and he doesn't want to return. So he thinks, okay, if I stow away, get into some transport that's going to France irregularly, hide somewhere, I will, be able to go to another country where I can actually do what I want to do, which is work as a migrant. He gets caught, he gets deported, and this doesn't end it for him. He's thinking, how else can I do this? Because he has this. And Schapendonk talks about how, this reflects the non-linearity of the migration journey, but particularly for people from the global south, where documentation becomes, you want to go elsewhere. So he wants to go to Spain, for example, but first he has to go to Cape Verde. So there's twists and turns of the migration journey that Schapendonk talks about. Aduni is one of our stakeholders who's talking to us about other people she works with, but she's also talking about her own migration experience, and she's highly educated. She's been in Europe from the time she was in secondary school education. Her parents sent her there to boarding school because they thought that a foreign education would give her a head start in life. She had it very difficult because as a young child, she faced a lot of challenges, belonging there. And then she gets to get used to it and then also miss being back in Nigeria. So she starts to inhabit this world. She marries a Nigerian, returns to Nigeria, but the husband doesn't want to stay. And so she moves back. And this is reflective of, Heraclitus is never the same river. You can never step in the same river. She's transformed as a result of her migration journey. And she finds herself, a sort of a transnational citizen living between these two worlds, neither here nor there, fully happy. She's a fulfilled person in Nigeria, but, tied to where she spent a significant part of her life. And she is trying to help others at the time that we met her establish a livelihood in Nigeria. Joy is a trafficked young lady. She starts working. Once her father dies, she starts working as a caterer, but her pay is not very good. And in this particular month, her employer is telling her, you missed some days, which she says she didn't miss, and she's frustrated. And someone comes to her and says, this is very cliche, what's a beautiful girl like you doing in this kind of place? Sort of selling opportunities. And she thinks that, this is someone who's trying to help her. One of her co-workers is also going to travel with her, so she thinks, oh, this is great. The co-worker tells her this is her sister, but that doesn't mean a blood sister. So she goes on this journey that she's been told she's going to do domestic work, and she's been presented with this beautiful picture, but once she leaves the border, she realizes that the journey is, really more tedious, and she starts asking questions. Why aren't we going with the plane? Why do we have to do this tedious road route? And by the time she reaches Mali, she realizes that this is not the journey she's planned for herself, and so she starts planning her escape. This is a rare case of which someone escapes their trafficker, is able to contact the government for help, and is returned. And she has returned. But things are not better off. She has got married, but she still doesn't have very good livelihood options. At the time she had a baby with us, she told us she was, roasting granules for sale. But sometimes her granules will get burnt while she's attending to the baby. She is in no way ready to repeat that. So the aspiration to achieve her livelihood, desire to escape her livelihood pressures through migration is off. She does not have any migration aspirations, but she does need and wants to improve her livelihood. And this really interesting case is about Ibidapo. Ibidapo has migrated often, and this has to do with a skill that is desired a lot. So he goes to the US and other places to play the bata, which is the Yoruba talking drum. And he finds that people like his skill, they want to work with him. But he doesn't have any offers either to do to have a sort of a tour or to perform long term. He only has these temporary offers. So he thinks that if he does migrate, it's going to truncate his career, because he will lose himself. He will not be able to work as a musician. So he doesn't want to take that option unless he finds, an opening through which he can actually use his skill, continue to use his skill. He's thinking of opening a school. He doesn't have the finances. So these are him talking about his life aspirations. He already met his migration aspiration. He wants, and this is about the non-linearity of this aspiration, but he wants to, continue to migrate, to continue to meet some life aspirations. So this is interesting. In conclusion, here's a picture of myself and somebody whom we spoke with during one of the interviews. I think that migration aspirations are both spatial and temporal. So it's where you ask the question. It's when we ask at origin, do you want to migrate? People tell us, oh yes, we do, but then I also want to come back. I then imagine their entire journey. When people ask at destination, they say things like, so for example, if I'm taking interviews done in the UK, the diaspora interviews, people say things like they have already met their aspiration to migrate, but they haven't been able to do, it hasn't been the success that they expected. So they haven't completely met their aspirations. So they do want to come back. If they have documentation, which most of our respondents in the UK had, they will visit. But until they're able to do something for themselves, build a house or do something, they don't want to return permanently, which is quite different from the way they express it when you're asking them at origin. So the imagining of the journey is different depending on where you're asking the questions. For example, we had meetings with what we call partners. So sister projects is what it's called in the EU Horizon parlance. And some people who were interviewing people, some of our partners who were interviewing at destination were telling us there wasn't an aspiration to return once the person reached the destination. And so mobility matters a lot. Here I want you to think about Jimo, who doesn't have that possibility to be mobile. So he keeps on thinking of, moving onwards rather than, back and forth and maintaining these national linkages or achieving his aspiration and returning, for example. This is a picture, those of you who are familiar with Ibadan, this is close to where you would take the bus to Lagos. So this is a picture I took on, one of our trips. And on this slide, I want to say that my main point is it is the nature of aspirations, as you've seen from those stories, that shift rather than, proportion of aspirations. And it is how they think of aspirations. So people who already, so for example, we had people who already were speaking to professors abroad and were trying to get into, we're looking at migration as an opportunity. They were not at the survival mode, for example, and that had to do with their capabilities, their educational background. So people may shift when they have these capabilities from one mode to another, but it's not really about quantities here, it's about nature. And what really, and I agree with Colin and Dehas and the general scholarship on aspirations, abilities, and capabilities, that capabilities matter to migration aspirations at origin, but that they also change the type, the nature of aspirations. So we saw that in Ibidapo, who was the guy with the music career. And here, we can't think about aspiration as being from one time and being linear. I only aspire to go to the US and that's the end of the aspiration, because this ignores the entire dynamics, including the return, and it overstates the aspiration to leave. Most times when you ask at source, there is an aspiration to return, and this has to do with temporary versus permanent migration, and how people view their journey. I told you that Mivodere changed her mind when she was confronted with new information, even though nothing happened in terms of her livelihood situation. And Lawrence did not change his mind, even though he was confronted with realities that he was not welcome in certain, labor markets. You would see this picture is one that my colleague took at Nikkei Art Gallery. It's one of the biggest galleries in Africa. They've got really beautiful pictures like this, so we've taken one of them. Thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome your question and answers.
Thank you so very much. We have so much um, information, and your presentation, I just didn't want it to end. So let's give a round of applause to Dr. Omolola Olarinde Olomola. First of all, for giving us this really great presentation. Secondly, for staying up past midnight to be doing it, and then to be connecting with us in real time from Nigeria. Um, so I think I enjoy your research because I am deeply interested in African migration. And Nigeria is my country, so I'm especially interested in Nigeria. I also am interested in the complicated and complex circumstances surrounding migration. So, I guess your research is confirming the fact that people have economic motivations and aspirations. And that many of them are also looking for some level of predictability in terms of migration routes and, knowing what the requirements are and then being able to meet those requirements in a kind of straightforward way, which is not the situation now. I have anecdotes because when I've gone to the American consulate in Lagos, I've seen all kinds of activities, including people praying,
Mm,
people charging money to pray for you, for your success, um, and all kinds of services. So there's a political economy that's growing up around that. And then in terms of the gender aspects of it, I'm also deeply interested. And I'm so glad that you spoke about some of that. I mean, people who are planning to go and then pregnancy, and then they have to take a pause. And that pause gets extended, and there's frustration. Younger men also, so young people, some people have described what majority of African youth are experiencing in this era as a situation of waithood, like, because they are not able to access what they need to become fully adult with responsibilities. They are waiting eternally, and this is why migration is so seductive. Because if you, let's say, graduate from university and you are now in your fifth year of informal employment, where you are not even able to afford rent, and your parents are still taking care of you if you have, family that's able to do that, or, you are squatting with friends and stuff. It can be very frustrating, and you are stuck in a like time warp. And so, I could say way more. People also face a lot of financial stressors. Um, and people are complimenting you, so maybe read the chat.
oh,
Um,
thank
so there are financial stressors that people face. I think it must also be psychologically draining when you're just trying and trying. And then people who kind of get up to North Africa and they get stuck, sometimes in very unpleasant ways. And then there are ways in which women also experience things that men don't experience. For example, there are stories about rape and all kinds of sexual exploitation. And then people who don't expect to be trafficked and then they become victims of trafficking. So, um, to to given the stressful aspects of migration, what makes people still interested in leaving? I think I have an idea, but I think maybe people would like to know a bit more about this. Then I heard you talking about training centers. So there are people who are, formally training people. What kinds of training are they offering, and does this plug into an employment opportunity at the other end? I'm curious about that. But I actually also wrote down some questions, so let me see if I can find them. So demographically, what's the percentage that's going, that has these aspirations? Um, you know, are they more young people? Are they a mix? And then in terms of the sex of the people, is it more men? Because, there's this idea that because of the ways in which migration can be had, that more young men are able to do what it takes. Like if you want to climb over fences and all these walls, you are more agile and whatever, So does that line up with your findings? So now my questions. So, Nigeria, how effective are the migrant resource centers that they said Nigeria has in practice? And, what kind of ways can they improve? What kind of improvements can they make to make themselves more useful to migrants? Then, in terms of the migration governance framework, what gaps do you see? Then COVID-19 stressed everything, affected everything. How did it affect migration patterns and policies in Nigeria? And have any of those changes persisted? Then, if you are using a decolonial lens, right? So, how does that change the way we understand African migration patterns? Um, so let me just stop there. I have way more, but we can talk later. Or if we have more time, I'll ask more questions. So those are some of the things I'm asking, but I don't want you to answer me yet. Maybe you could combine it with answers to audience who have been very patient in waiting and listening and probably have also significant questions they want to ask you. So are there any questions? If you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. Or comment. Or maybe okay, Ajada. Ajada, can you show us your face too? Ajada is my student, so I can ask her to do that. Yeah. Hello. Yeah, your question.
Hello, can you hear and see me?
Yeah. Can everybody see Ajada?
Oh, wonderful.
Let me side by
So
side.
I'm having
Okay.
internet issues today.
Okay, yeah. What's your question?
Dr. Yes, Dr. Omola, thank you once again so much for this excellent and this very apt and very presently needed presentation. I'm trying to contain my excitement because it's also something that I desire to study a lot more, and I'm just so glad that you were able to take the time to share with us. I have equally a lot of questions, but I'll try to refrain to maybe about two or three. Um, so in talking about aspirations and the way that they are dynamic and also transient, the way that they change and that they are temporal at times too, I'm interested to hear more about how these kinds of desires kind of orient around self identity and belonging, especially because in belonging um, a- abroad is certainly something that you mentioned in some of the narratives and picking them out. How does belonging in the origin country also shape these kinds of aspirations and the dynamics there and why they change, and especially belonging in an employed environment? So that's one question. Another question pertaining to religion and other sort of spiritual aspirations as well. How are there any ways that you can see that religion or religiosity has, I guess, like an empirical tie to not only education level or even areas of employment, but also, uh, I guess, a centrality in how these aspirations form and how they may either be life aspirations or migratory aspirations.
All right, thank you, Ajada.
And
Oh, you still
and
have more?
then the blob bridge, I love that so much. And it's
Ajada, maybe you should go off camera so that because it seems like you
yes, I
have,
do. I'm sorry, did I cut out?
yeah, you cut out. So maybe go off camera, then we'll be able to hear you. All right, try now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
So sorry about that.
No worries.
The last one for now is the blog
Okay,
page
Ajeda,
or
maybe type it into the
replays
text
of that
because we can't hear you
you had
properly.
mentioned as well. Okay.
Type it into the text.
Okay, will do.
All right,
Thank you so much.
Dr. Olomola, maybe we have another question from a brilliant graduate from our master's program, Chinedu. Chinedu, yes.
Yes. Good evening, Professor Kome, and thank you for the invite.
Good evening.
This was a brilliant presentation, Professor Olomola. My question is, in a course I took last semester, the Professor Ness, he wrote a book. It's called Migration as Economic Imperialism, and we've seen the Japa trends. I'm one of the people that Japa from Nigeria, so I concur. So, but what I want to say is that do you think there's a concerted effort from the West to, in a sense, create the conditions that are necessary for them to exploit low-level or low-wage workers in the West? Do you think it's a concerted effort from the West and its allies to create these conditions, or do you think it's something that's happening just organically from bad leadership in Nigeria?
All right, very good. So let's have those two questions answered, and maybe one of mine, and then we'll take another round.
Oh, great. I think let me just take from yours. Maybe I should start with the migrant resource centers. So right now there are three of them in Lagos, Abuja, and I believe in Kaduna, and there are about three more coming up. And so one thing I would say about the way migration governance, which is another question that you have, is the way the system works in Nigeria is that a lot of funding is external. And there is where the gaps that you mentioned exist. So if you want to put your foot down and talk about what your own national interests are, there will be a need to back that with some funding, which is what is not available. Now, so that delves into how effective they can be. Now, in terms of potential, they have a lot of potential. For example, there's this design of what they call the National Electronic Employment Platform, which is a website that acts sort of like a job matching website. So it's part of the the labor ecosystem, but the way it should work is it should work globally. So people who are looking for workers from across the globe can advertise on the NELEX, but also Nigerians across different states can, supplement their adverts on other websites on this NELEX website. But they've had persistent challenges with just functionality. So they always have to redesign and that kind of, when people want to put adverts somewhere, they want some kind of stability. They want to know that the advert will be there and will show up, and people who are seeking either to take up employment with them or any other way will be able to use those facilities. And so this instability has been a problem. So what we have is a lot of potential that is currently underachieved at the MRCs. But they are, I've been there a number of times. They have a very good framework in which that brings me to what the training centers are doing, in which they try to with the German government. So they have partnership with the GIZ, for example, where they try to empower Nigerians. So that's the whole narrative of migration development nexus. So if you empower people, they will stay back. There's little evidence supporting that, but there are a number of trainings in that direction where people get some skills. The challenges with those trainings are they either do not go on long enough for the person to get a strong certification, or even when they finish, the people do not have the capability to use that. You know, they don't have money to set up their business, so they are just trying to shop, you know, jump from training to training and just stay on that rather than actually become, you know, employed afterwards. So that takes me to the second set of questions around self-identity and belonging. And I'm going to, you know, there was a question about how does belonging in origins shape aspirations. I'm going to speak about this with regards to gender and the fact that we know from, for example, from the Gallup data and from, there's an OECD data called the CG, which is the social indicators and social and gender indexes, indicators. And we know from there that women who face more discrimination, depending, yeah, so there's a threshold. So they tend to want to migrate more up to a particular threshold, meaning that at a certain level of very high discrimination, that just squashes the aspiration to migrate entirely. So there is this belonging and that is shapes aspiration that we found. I also want to talk about return, and again this is gendered. So for women are judged more harshly, especially if they've had a failed migration journey. And the other thing is women, the expectations on women, the dual expectations to fulfill familial roles and to fulfill work roles remain. So if women migrate and are successful in their careers, they sometimes fail in the eyes of society, so to speak, in their familial expectations. So there comes the harsh judgment of, well, you didn't get married, well, you don't have children, well, you failed in one aspect of your life. And this is peculiar to women. And when women know that if they return, this is the kind of difficulty that they're going to face, that reduces the aspiration to return. So specifically focusing on our own study, that is what I think I would say. I hope I answered, I was able to provide some insight. With regards to religion and religiosity, so we did ask people what religion they practiced. There was a fair mix because it was Lagos of, you know, Muslims, Christians, and people, a couple of people who identified as non-religious. But I didn't pursue that to tie it to aspirations because there wasn't a detailed discussion. Now, we don't have a representative sample, so it's not about generalizability. So 46 interviews is rarely something that you can use for quantitative representation. So we don't have a representative sample. I can just, you know, pull up a graph on the relationship between religion and aspirations, but apart from that, there was not detailed discussion, which is why I skipped it entirely regarding religiousness. But for example, we know in Nigeria from previous research that you know, that there's the whole idea of networks and where people go to, and the idea that you're tied more closely to where you have cultural and religious affinity. And we know, for example, that people from the Southwest region want to go to you know, places like the UK, like Canada, well, less now to the UK and the US, a bit more to Canada and other European countries outside the UK. So we know that, and this is mostly a Christian Southwest thing, but also Muslim Southwest. But when you look at Northern Nigeria, they have different cultural affinities. So I'll just say that generally, but not very much I can say on religion. With regards to the question on imperialism, well, even though I took a decolonial framing, I didn't particularly measure this. But what I can say is this. Two things. First is the idea that if there's going to be some fairness, in fairness, I mean wage equality, you know, better wage equality across countries, then we're going to have some global standards as to what what skills mean. So, for example, having a university degree in Nigeria does not necessarily translate to getting a job that honors that degree once you go abroad. And we see that a lot. So except you've deliberately tried to move upwards and most of the time people do this the way that you're doing it, Chinedu, getting another level of education abroad so that they can then, maybe if you want to enter the labor market or if not, return with a better qualifications. So there is a de-skilling that happens when people leave, particularly from the global south, where the degrees are not recognized, and especially softer degrees, business degrees or political science degrees. Whether or not that is deliberate, I don't know, because my research didn't focus on that. But what I do think is that there is a need to integrate global markets. The other thing I want to mention is this level of labor market integration is what is missing currently. But I do understand your concerns. I mean, I have colleagues who are working in multinationals. I have former students who are working in multinationals who are based in Nigeria. One of them told me recently, well, my colleague who's working in another country gets 10 times my pay, but we have the same role. So there is that wage inequality, and it's both a driver, so an influence. So if just shifting where I am changes how much money I get, maybe all I need to do is shift my location. There's the location economics of it. So that could also be contributing to an aspiration to leave. So you just want the aspiration to leave to get better chances at getting a good wage rather than really wanting to live elsewhere. So thank you so much for that very interesting question. I'm going to look up the one on the blob bridge and respond.
Okay. So do you want to take more questions in the meantime?
Oh, yes,
Okay.
I'm happy to.
So do we have any more questions or comments? Should I put people on the spot? Hunter says, thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Omolola. My question is, do you see parallels between the Nigerian Japada phenomenon and migration return patterns in other African or global South contexts? What, in your view, makes Nigeria's case distinct? Excellent question. So any other ones? People can also raise their hands. As we're
Okay.
waiting, I want to actually ask about intersectionality. And then I'll read Nicholas's question. So what intersectional factors have you found most significant in your research? Like, you are looking at gender, you are looking at class, and then nationality. Which ones do you find most significant? But Nicholas, in the meantime, asked this question. How does migration affect family structures and relationships in Nigeria? And what challenges do Nigerian migrants face in integrating into new societies? Excellent again. My students are brilliant. Okay, yeah. Do you want to take those now?
Absolutely. Okay. So parallels between migration in Nigeria and other African countries. So when I think of other African countries, so there's this south of the Sahara kind of problem, and then the North Africa kind of problem. And if I think about south of the Sahara compared to North Africa, I think about a different set of possibilities. So, for example, Morocco labor agreements that they already have with Germany, for example, and other European countries, Spain, for example. So there is already the formal formalization of pathways and the negotiation of this formalization. And I also think about south of the Sahara. I think about Kenya, whose movements did you have to make? So there is the tie between, getting more funding and agreeing to certain things such as the return of irregular migrants, or, even in some extremes, externalization of borders. So there is that complexity when you sign agreements. And Nigeria claims to be representing the rights of the citizens and being slow to signing those agreements because they're careful about, what compromises they could make. I cannot verify that, but that's the claim at the moment. But what really needs to be done, that there's a lot, and these are things that have been said in a lot of forums that have been present, and government officials have been present. So these are not new things. Things like transfer of social benefits, things like, not the skilling, so transfer of skills in a proper way, harmonization of skills, even across Africa, that we're aware needs to be done. But, we haven't been able to step up to that. With regards to family structures, so what we asked was about marital status, and then later about, just talking about their familial life. So, for example, when I was talking about Joy and her marriage and her child, and how she had to juggle that with self-employment and the difficulties she was facing, those were the kind of narratives that emerged from our work. So, with regards to deeper narratives about, the families left behind. So when a woman migrates, the families left behind. I don't have, direct references to that. But what I do have is regarding Professor Come's question on intersectionality. And particularly regarding gender. So with regards to age and educational status, that we thought, so we know most of our respondents who had an aspiration, some level of migration status, either aspiration or plan, or, or actually had a migration journey, they were mostly young people, and most of them were between 26 and 35. So there is that, young men and women who migrate, but there was not any strong distinction in our sample by age or education. So the sample was more homogeneous than we wanted in terms of age. What was really distinct where we found intersectionality was in terms of marital status. And this was for whether you were married or single. Now, single people had higher aspirations and had more experience, had attempted the journey more than married people. And for women in particular, being a single woman, in terms of proportions, being a woman, you had lower aspirations and lower chances of migrating. So lower aspirations, lower plans, lower migration experience than men generally. But single women had higher aspirations than single men. So it was about, that shift between singlehood and being married. So we had narratives such as, married women saying, I did want to migrate, but now I'm married, or I do have to get my husband's permission before I can marry, before I can migrate, and the limitations that married life has on migration. But as I said before, this is really a very difficult thing for women, because even if they do migrate as single women, the societal expectations, the normative, the cultural expectation on them is to eventually get married. And that's not relaxed because they've had a successful career or they've migrated and are remitting money back home. They continue to be judged harshly for not having established a familial life, and men don't get that judgment. However, men do, and this has to do with, ageism. Men do say things about, so for example, we had one of our respondents who was saying opportunities mostly ended at the age of 40, and that he needed to speed up his, meeting up his aspirations before he attained the age of 40, because, he was going to miss a lot. And he was 35. So there was this intensification because he had this age barrier that was before him, in which he thought, if I just cross that threshold, I'm no more, youthful, and I miss those opportunities. So those intersecting factors exists, particularly familial status and migration aspirations. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions? I do. So let me just ask mine while people are thinking. I think I see something in the text. So what challenges have you faced in doing this research? Also, how do you measure returns to migration in terms of development outcomes? And then let me see what's there in the chat. Oh, wow. Okay. Ajeda has a lot to say,
Thank
which
you
is
for
great.
engaging, Ajada.
Yeah, Ajeda is always great that way. So she says, thank you once again for your presentation and your time. If I may, my questions are, there's a few. One, recognizing that Japa reflects sociocultural and economic shifts and a relatively newfound urgency. Can you speak on how time and global shifts also reshape aspirations, especially as it pertains to the Nigerian economy? Second, may you also speak on the ways that space and awareness of spaces may shape aspirations, or a description of plans. Three, she goes back to the blob bridge. The blob bridge is wonderful. I do think so too. You had also shared that participants shared frustrations, noting that it was made by those asking the question. In areas like the blob bridge, though meant to encourage conversation, how, as a researcher, can you contend with unintentional framing? And may you share more on the process on achieving a non-linear outlook. You could write a book on these three things. So um, I think you should privilege her question over mine, because I
Oh,
think they're so.
absolutely. And I will start with the blob bridge. So thank you very much, Ajada. Very interesting questions. So yes, we did enjoy using the blob bridge. We intended it to provoke emotion and to sort of shift the conversation towards a more sincere and, less veiled conversation. And so when we heard things like anger as an emotion, it was welcome. It was welcome. I think that there is not a right. So the way we started was, here is an image. What do you think is happening? Because obviously the blob bridge is interpretable subjectively. So people, you might think you see. It was really interesting what people thought they saw that we never saw. So the blob bridge is interpretable, and we expected them to think about it subjectively. So the first step is to get them to think about what's happening, and then to identify personally with what was happening
All
there.
right, I'm getting off. Thank you.
Oh, Prof,
Yes.
would you like to ask a question before you go?
Well, let her answer, and then I will ask my question.
Okay, good.
All
Thank you.
right. So, with regards to using this as a tool, you want to get a subjective impression about how they view generally the migration journey, and then specifically where they think they are. And it's something that will be interpreted, more fluidly. So, how the person saw themselves and what part of aspirations are they in. Now, usually they will choose, well, we asked them to choose one particular sport. So it wasn't something that they could think about their future. But I think this is a very interesting outlook where you ask them, where do you think you are now? Where do you think you want to be? Or where do you think you were before? And then you can use this tool to capture non-linearity. I hope that answers Ajada. I'll take Prof's question and then take your other two.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
So, Prof, your
All right.
question.
Thank you very much. And regrets. I don't mean to preempt anybody, but one question and one comment. The question, it comes from a conference I attended in Ghana about a decade ago, funded by the Dutch government. And there was a publication that Professor Tetua Manu produced, and I have a chapter in there. But one of the things I remember taking away has to do with this issue of aspirations, because aspirations, as I've heard it, this evening, it's very much aspirations coming from individuals and their different, where they are in their lives and so on. But one of the things I took away from that conference is how aspirations have become such a sociocultural force. And the aspiration that in order to succeed, the having gone abroad and acquire degrees or employment and so on was such a driving factor. But I'll just mention that since aspirations is, and the second one is the migration is such a extraordinary issue in the US right now. And I'm just thinking, and this is my comment, of not only the politicization but the dehumanization of migrants in the United States, and I would assume in elsewhere in the world, and just thinking about how some narratives about these experiences could really contribute to being able to think. I mean, people thinking about migration in more human terms. That might connect with more with them and their own lives and their own family histories. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. Omolola.
Thank you so kindly for your comment. And it reminds me of something that was recurrent throughout the last IMISCO conference in Paris. And that was the fact that, migration studies is not working from the humanized perspective, because we keep thinking about these migrants as a unique identity, whereas they are first people and then they're second migrants. I think that I agree with you that we really need to bring back the human, so the woman who is, so rather than talking about this, and I attempted to do that a bit, I don't know how much successfully, rather than talking about the woman migrants, you talk about the mother who has a child, and this humanizing that you speak about, because at the end of the day, it's this idea of othering, of that there's this migrant who's different from me, or who's foreign, or who's alien, and it's there that the possibility of dehumanizing comes in, and much of it is about the way that the global social welfare system is organized, and the claims that certain groups they contribute to this social welfare system and they don't need to share it with groups who didn't contribute to it. This is really a narrative that we need to deal with in terms of resource sharing. But it's a lot to unpack there. So thank you so much. And yes, I totally also agree with you in terms of the social context of, migration aspirations, how they're formed. I have a bit to say about, the way that Stark thinks about aspirations as a family decision and the role of society. And what I really want to say is that I'm doing some work on that, in which I think about Stark's work, and our data, our evidence supports him, that a lot of times people share their aspirations with their family, and their family support them either financially or through different kinds of encouragement. But when people think that they're not going to receive support from the family, and this is like women, like the lady who I presented, who was trafficked, she didn't go home to tell her mom, oh, I've seen this woman who's going to take me away. She thought, well, what's my mom going to do? She's not going to give me money. She might discourage me. I better not tell her. So there is the part of disclosure, where people disclose their aspirations when they think they're going to get support. And that really affects how we're able to judge the society and the family's contribution to this aspiration. But mostly in our data, we've found evidence that the family is usually supportive and encouraging of migration aspirations, even if just in kind. And so thank you very much for pointing that out. Yes, there's the meso part of it all, where, family and society do play a role. So do I go back to
back to my question.
Oh, yes, back to your questions, the
Yeah.
challenges we face. Well, one thing, so we did, I think the way we did it, we worked in work packages, and different people had different responsibilities. And where we've had the most representative data is from digital, that data that we collected digitally. So for example, we had a Facebook study where we collected 600,000 samples of postbook. Yes, and then we used large language models to analyze it. So there is the fact that there's a shift towards cheaper digital data, right? And so, we've done 46 interviews, but we have 600,000 on Facebook, and we had this, we had a number of, and I will share one with you if you circulate among your groups. We're doing a final survey among how researchers think about migration. So please do feel free to share. So those ones that we could transmit virtually, we had this large data sets that were really interesting. So I think that now one of the challenges we now have is then, triangulating all our results. So as I presented during our methodology, we had all of these different groups collecting data, and the data sharing and thinking of common ways in which we could analyze has been quite a challenge. We do have a report on all of Africa, for example, but beyond that, just merging what's happened in a more rich way between origin, transit, and destination, that has been challenging. So the methodology of using all these rich data sets to sort of converge, on a few key findings has been the difficulties. And someone asked about the returns to migration. Yes, now there's been a lot of focus on remittances, and that being the major thing that we need to look at. But it's a cost and returns. So there's been a lot of focus on diaspora, investments and bonds and what we have in Nigeria. But there's more than that. And one thing I'd like us to focus on is the fact that when people have regular migration pathways, and this was especially expressed by men, rather than women. So in our sample, women talked about migration from, and I think this was socially constructed, vulnerabilities. Well, I can't make a living here, I'm going to make. Men talked about it from an opportunistic perspective. I'm already making a living, but I think if I go elsewhere and I find how they do things differently in this same field, and I bring that knowledge back here, I'm going to cause a shift in the labor market. So these kind of opportunities was mainly expressed by men, but there are returns to migration that are less captured. So the fact that and this is really more about mobility than one-time migration. So being able to go and maintain these linkages is what we need to look at a little more from my perspective. Ajada, on your socio-cultural and economic shifts, how time and global shifts. So this is quite complex. I think that recently, what I want to emphasize is that, like when we talk about Japa, as if, Prof was asking me about proportions of people who want to leave. We didn't measure that specifically. There are various studies, some in the medical sciences talking about between 60 and 80%. We didn't measure that specifically, how many people want to leave, because I don't think that's really, that's not why we didn't measure it. But right now, I don't think that's really the question. I think the question is, when people aspire to go, what are these aspirations made of? So is it origin push? Is it opportunities abroad? Is it just, better livelihood? Is it moving around and getting opportunities from mobility? The way that other cultures are able to, for example, in the global south, the Philippines, or, in the global north, generally the movement across the EU. And that brings me to the intra-Africa movement, and we have not signed the free mobility protocol of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So although we speak about this intra-African free movement, I don't think that we have committed seriously to it. And so this shapes, so some of the aspirations can be met within the continent, some cannot. Some of the aspirations are just to migrate, but some are for livelihood opportunities that take a long time to achieve. And so this is what we need to think of. But I don't know if I'm not convinced that we need to reshape aspirations. What I'm convinced is, that we need to understand that these aspirations are, not the way we're currently presenting them in literature. People who are more employed aspire more because they have the capabilities. It's beyond that. So once they achieve those capabilities, what's the next thing? It's that non-linearity that's the crux of the matter, in my opinion. And then the awareness of spaces and how they shift. Well, I don't know if you said this, it will be more easier for me to understand. The description of plans, space and awareness of spaces shape aspirations, and the description of plans.
So Ajada, do you want to explain a bit more?
I still don't know if you can hear me, but
Yeah, we can hear you.
oh, wonderful. So yes, I am also very much interested in the nature of aspirations, and so I think I didn't word my first question as properly as I had hoped to, but it's less to try and figure out what external origins sort of force or have to reshape aspirations, but exactly how they may tie into the ways that aspirations both fluctuate, change, or stretch over time. So how the nature may be may have to contend with contemporary things, and also that sense of urgency. That was mainly what I meant by that question. And then as for the second one, something noted, I'm not exactly sure which part rather it was, but where these interviews were being conducted and where you got to speak with people, and also that space. So I'm curious to know more about how those spaces that you're in, and both you as the interviewer and the interviewee's sense of that space may also, well, I guess perhaps not shape, but describe and perhaps even modify aspirations, at least in how they've been described in the plans.
Oh, yes, that's a really interesting question on space. So, yes, because we both conveniently and purposively sampled, so we kind of have an over bias of aspirations. So if it was just random, I'm sure we wouldn't have that much concentration of aspirations. So the whole thing has one form of aspiration or the other, either from desire to having already fulfilled the migration journey. And so I think that, being the way that we conducted the interview shapes, what kind of responses we've got. And that was intentional, because we wanted to focus lazily on aspirations, but also being Lagos. So, the way the design happened, since we were looking for people who already had some form of aspirations in order to understand the migration decision, we chose Lagos, which is a hub, sort of, where people, it's a, multicultural, lots of Nigerians. We have a column on ethnicity, and it's really a very good mix of many ethnicities in our sample. And they already have at least an internal migration experience, the respondents. So that's really interesting. But also the fact that once they've had an internal migration experience, if they want to move onward, that also shapes. So people talk about, oh, it's been a good experience so far. I've come to Lagos and I think I'd like to move forward, kind of. So that shapes how they think about the plans in the future. I hope that explains it a bit.
So, does anybody have a last question? Because I want to give Dr. Omolola Olarinde Olomola a chance to get some rest before she starts her day, because it's morning now in Nigeria. So any last question? Anybody? Going once, twice, or comment? Okay, so I just want to say that I thoroughly enjoyed this, and I wish, Ajieda says, thank you very much. Please have a good morning. And I saw Mrs. Savage's comment also, that this is a great presentation, an excellent presentation. Thank you for taking the time, and have a good morning. So I also want to join her in saying it was a delightful experience. We thoroughly enjoyed it and benefited from your cutting edge research and the interesting way in which you presented. And we wish we could keep you because, believe it or not, I mean, my class actually ends 50 minutes from now. But I think I'm going to give my students a break to go think about what you've said. I encourage them to write responses, in terms of what they get out of this. So maybe they could use the rest of the class time to do that. But everybody, you can unmute, and let's give a round of applause to a great scholar and ask her if she would want to come back to Brooklyn College, maybe in person, right? To give us another presentation. So thank you so much. And if you can't clap, you can do the virtual clap. We thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So have a good day. I hope you'll be able to take a little rest before. you
Oh,
go
I
to
will.
work.
Thank you so much. It's been delightful being with you. Thank you for your pertinent questions. I've really enjoyed my evening with you.
Yes, and Sania said thank you also. Even the people who didn't speak, I think they have enjoyed this. So do come back.
Thank you. I look forward to that. I appreciate the
Okay.